What if the largest moving object ever built by human hands, a floating world of iron and light meant to carry more than 2,000 souls across the cold Atlantic, slipped beneath the waves on a still and starlit night, only 4 days into the first voyage it would ever make? What if the ship that people called unsinkable, the pride of an age that believed almost anything could be conquered by steel and steam, came to rest more than 2 miles down in the dark of the sea, where no light reaches and no sound travels, and stayed hidden there for more than 70 years before anyone found her again? Tonight, we will follow the long and quiet story of the Titanic, from the shipyards of Belfast, where her ribs of steel first rose against the sky, through the great harbors of England, France, and Ireland, where she gathered her passengers, and out onto the open ocean where her journey ended far too soon. We will walk slowly through the world that built her, the people who sailed on her, the ordinary lives folded into her decks, and the cold night that turned a shining palace of the sea into one of the most remembered stories of the modern age. This is not a story of noise. It is a story of iron and water, of hope and quiet, of the small human moments inside a very large machine. So let the room grow soft around you. Lower the lights, rest your head, and let your breathing slow. There is nothing here you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Let this calm journey across the ocean of the past move gently around you, the way the sea itself moves at night, slow and dark and endless, while the story unfolds at its own hurried pace. If you find comfort in these quiet journeys through history, in old worlds visited softly in the dark, you are welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need another calm walk through the past. There is no hurry. The story will always be here, waiting like a lamp left burning in a window. And now, let us begin, not with the ship, but with the world that dreamed her into being. To understand the Titanic, we must first understand the age that made her, an age that has often been called the age of confidence. In the last years of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th, much of the Western world had come to believe in the almost unlimited power of human invention. It was a time when railways crossed continents, when telegraph wires carried messages beneath the oceans, when factories poured out iron and steel in quantities that would have seemed like magic only a century before. Cities glowed at night with electric light where once there had been only candle and gas. People spoke of progress not as a hope, but as a certainty, as if the future were a road that led always upward, always onward, into something brighter than the past. At the heart of this confident world lay the North Atlantic Ocean, and across that ocean ran one of the busiest and most important routes in all of human history. On one side stood Europe, old and crowded, with its empires and its factories, its poverty and its ambition. On the other side stood the United States, vast and growing, hungry for people to fill its cities and work its industries. Between these two worlds moved a river of ships, carrying goods and letters, business travelers and diplomats, and above all, an endless tide of ordinary people leaving their homes forever, in search of a different life. In the decades around the year 1900, millions of men, women, and children crossed that ocean, packed into the lower decks of steamships, leaving behind villages in Ireland, Italy, Scandinavia, and the lands of Eastern Europe, hoping to begin again on the far shore. The ocean itself was and remains a difficult and dangerous thing. The North Atlantic in particular is a cold and moody sea, prone to fog and sudden storms, its northern waters chilled by currents that carry ice down from the frozen edges of the world. In the spring, great masses of ice break away from the glaciers of Greenland and drift slowly southward, some of them enormous, their pale shapes floating silently across the shipping lanes. Sailors had known of this danger for as long as they had crossed those waters, and they treated the sea with the respect that experience teaches. Yet, as ships grew larger and faster, and as the pressure of business and pride pushed captains to keep to their schedules, that old respect began, in some quarters, to soften into something more like habit. The ships that crossed this ocean were not simply vessels. They had become symbols. The great shipping companies of Britain, Germany, and other nations competed fiercely with one another, and their finest liners were floating advertisements for the wealth and skill of the countries that built them. To own the fastest ship, the largest ship, the most luxurious ship, was a matter of national pride as much as commercial gain. Newspapers followed the launch of each new giant with the excitement that later ages would reserve for other kinds of marvels. The liner became a kind of moving city, a demonstration of what the modern world could achieve when it turned its full attention to a single grand project. Among the companies that competed on the Atlantic, one of the most famous was a British firm known as the White Star Line. For years it had struggled against its great rival, whose ships had won fame chiefly for their speed. The White Star Line, guided by the vision of its chairman, chose a different path. Rather than trying to win the contest for the fastest crossing, it decided to compete on a different ground altogether. It would build ships that were not necessarily the swiftest, but the largest and the most comfortable. Ships that would make the voyage itself a pleasure, rather than merely a passage. Ships so grand that travelers would choose them for the sheer experience of being aboard. Out of this decision came a plan for a class of 3 enormous liners, sister ships that would set a new standard for size and luxury on the sea. The Titanic was the second of these 3. The plan for these great ships is said to have taken shape in conversation among the men who led the White Star Line and the shipbuilders who would construct them. In the comfortable rooms where the powerful of that age discussed their ambitions. The vision was bold. These vessels would be nearly 900 feet long, taller from keel to funnel top than many buildings, weighing tens of thousands of tons. They would carry more people than many towns held, and they would be fitted out with a level of comfort and elegance that had never before been offered at sea, at least not for those who could afford the finest accommodations. Grand staircases, dining rooms like the halls of great hotels, private promenades, electric lighting throughout, and every modern convenience the age could provide. The task of building these ships fell to the shipyard of Harland and Wolff, in the city of Belfast, in the north of Ireland. This was one of the greatest shipyards in the world, a vast landscape of slipways and cranes, workshops and warehouses, spread along the water where the river Lagan met the sea. Belfast in those years was a city of industry, its skyline marked by the towering gantries of the yard, its air filled with the sound of hammers and rivets, its streets crowded with the workers who made their living from the building of ships. Tens of thousands of men labored at Harland and Wolff, and the yard was in many ways the beating heart of the city. To build the Titanic and her sisters, the yard had to construct new and enormous structures, simply to hold the ships as they rose. The great gantry that stood over the slipways became a landmark visible for miles, a cathedral of steel beneath, which the giants would take shape. Let us pause here and imagine that place, for it is worth dwelling on. Picture Belfast in the years around 1909 when work on the Titanic began in earnest. Picture the cold northern light of an Irish morning, the gray sky reflected in the water of the harbor, the smoke rising from 1,000 chimneys across the city. Picture the men walking to work in the early hours, their caps pulled low, their boots ringing on the cobblestones, carrying their lunches wrapped in cloth, breathing the damp air that smelled of coal and salt and the sea. And picture, rising above them all, the vast skeleton of the ship, her ribs of steel curving upward like the bones of some enormous creature, the frame of a vessel so large that men working upon her looked like insects crawling across her sides. The building of such a ship was slow, dangerous, and deeply human work. The great hull was assembled from thousands upon thousands of steel plates, each one lifted into place and fastened to the frame by rivets, small metal bolts driven red-hot through holes in the steel, and then hammered flat while still glowing, so that as they cooled they drew the plates tightly together. Some of this riveting was done by machine, but much of it was done by hand, by teams of men who worked in a rhythm passed down through generations of shipbuilders. A boy would heat the rivet in a small furnace until it glowed, then toss it to a catcher who seized it with tongs and thrust it into place, and then the hammermen would strike it, their blows falling in swift alternation, the sound of thousands of such hammers together forming the constant music of the yard. It was hard and hazardous labor. The shipyards of that age were dangerous places, and accidents were common. Men fell from heights, were struck by falling objects, or were injured by the machinery and the heavy materials they handled. Records suggest that during the construction of the Titanic, several workers lost their lives, and many more were hurt. These men are often forgotten in the grand story of the ship. Their names rarely spoken, yet they were as much a part of her as the steel they shaped. Each rivet driven into her hull represented a moment of human effort, a swing of a tired arm, a bead of sweat, a life given over, day after day, to the making of something greater than any single person could achieve alone. When we think of the Titanic, it is worth remembering these builders, the ordinary men of Belfast whose hands raised her from nothing. The construction went on for years. The keel was laid, the frame rose, the hull took shape, and slowly the outline of the ship emerged against the sky. By the spring of 1911, the hull was ready to be launched. That is, to be released from the slipway and allowed to slide into the water for the first time, so that the rest of the work, the fitting out, could be completed while she floated at a dock. The launch of such a ship was a great public event. On the day the Titanic's hull entered the water, crowds gathered along the banks of the river to watch. The hull, at this stage, was only a shell, an empty vessel without engines, funnels, or interior, painted for the occasion, its great mass held back by supports until the moment came to release it. When the moment arrived, the enormous hull began to move, sliding down the greased slipway with a slow and gathering momentum, until it slipped into the water and floated free, sending waves rolling across the harbor. It is said that there was no formal ceremony of naming with the breaking of a bottle, as was the custom with some other companies. The White Star Line preferred a simpler approach. But the launch itself was witnessed by many thousands, and for those who saw it, the sight of that vast dark hull moving into the water must have been unforgettable. After the launch came the long and detailed work of turning an empty hull into a living ship. This was the fitting out, and it took nearly another year. During this time, the great engines were installed. 3 of them, driving the ship forward with the power of tens of thousands of horses. The boilers were placed in their rooms deep within the hull, 29 of them, fed by the coal that would be shoveled by hand throughout the voyage by the men known as firemen or stokers, who labored in the hot and dark spaces below the waterline. The funnels were raised, 4 of them, tall and slightly raked, giving the ship her distinctive and famous silhouette, though in truth only 3 of the funnels carried smoke from the boilers, while the 4th was largely for appearance and ventilation, added because the designers felt that 4 funnels looked more powerful and balanced than 3. And then there was the fitting of the interiors, which was where the true ambition of the White Star Line revealed itself. The Titanic was designed to offer 3 classes of accommodation, and the difference between them reflected, in miniature, the wider divisions of the society that built her. The first class was intended for the wealthy, the powerful, and the fashionable, and no expense was spared in making their quarters magnificent. There was a grand staircase of polished oak, descending beneath a great domed skylight of iron and glass, lit by a chandelier, watched over by a carved clock. There were dining saloons finished in the styles of old European palaces, a reception room where an orchestra played, a smoking room paneled in dark wood, a reading and writing room for the ladies, a lounge modeled on the elegant rooms of the palace at Versailles. There was even a swimming bath filled with heated seawater, and a room fitted with the equipment for exercise, and a Turkish bath decorated in a style meant to recall the tiled rooms of the East. For those who could afford it, the Titanic was less a ship than a floating grand hotel, a place where one could cross the ocean and scarcely feel that one had left the comforts of the land at all. The second class, too, was comfortable, offering accommodations that on many other ships would have counted as first class. Its passengers were the respectable middle sort of that age, professionals and clergy, teachers and tradespeople, families of modest means who traveled with dignity, if not with luxury. They had their own dining room, their own library, their own promenade, and their own smoking room, and their cabins were clean and pleasant, if plainer than those above. The third class, which was often called steerage, was where most of the passengers by number actually traveled, and it was where the human heart of the voyage truly lay. These were the emigrants, the ordinary men, women, and children leaving Europe for a new life across the sea. Many of them had sold what little they owned to buy their tickets. They came from Ireland and from Scandinavia, from the lands of the crumbling empires of Central and Eastern Europe, from the villages of the Middle East, from all the places where poverty or hardship or simple hope pushed people toward the promise of America. Their quarters were far below the grand rooms of the first class, deep in the ship near the bow and the stern, in cabins that were plain and small, but, by the standards of the emigrant ships of earlier years, remarkably clean and decent. They had their own dining room, serving simple but plentiful food, and their own open spaces on the lower decks where they could take the air. For many of these travelers, even the modest comfort of the Titanic's third class was finer than anything they had known at home. And so the ship, when at last she was complete, was in a sense 3 worlds stacked one upon another, 3 layers of society sharing a single hull, each mostly unaware of the others, separated by locked gates and unspoken rules, yet all bound together in the same great voyage across the same dark water, the wealthy in their paneled lounges, the middle sort in their tidy cabins, and the poor in their crowded quarters below, all carried forward by the same engines, all breathing the same salt air, all trusting the same steel to keep the sea outside, where it belonged. It was this trust, this deep and almost unquestioned confidence, that would come to define the Titanic's story. The ship was built with a number of safety features that were considered advanced for their time. Her hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by bulkheads, walls that ran across the width of the ship if the hull were damaged and water began to flood in. Doors in these bulkheads could be closed, sealing off the flooded compartments, and, in theory, keeping the rest of the ship dry and afloat. The design was such that the ship could remain afloat even if several of these compartments were flooded, more than would be expected in almost any ordinary accident. It was because of this feature that people came to speak of the Titanic as practically unsinkable, though it is worth noting that the builders themselves were more careful in their claims than the popular imagination later remembered. The phrase took on a life of its own, repeated in newspapers and in conversation, until many came to believe that the ship truly could not be sunk by any force the ocean might bring against her. Yet, there was a flaw hidden in this confidence, a flaw that would matter greatly on the fatal night. The watertight bulkheads did not rise all the way to the top of the ship. They extended only a certain height above the waterline. In ordinary flooding, this was more than sufficient, but if enough compartments at the front of the ship were to fill with water, the bow would sink lower, and water could then spill over the tops of the bulkheads from one compartment into the next, like water rising over the walls of an ice cube tray, until compartment after compartment was overwhelmed. This danger was understood by the designers in principle, but it was considered so unlikely a scenario that little thought was given to it. Who, after all, could imagine an accident severe enough to breach so many compartments at once? There was another matter, too, one that would haunt the memory of the disaster for generations. The Titanic did not carry enough lifeboats for all the people aboard. She carried 20 lifeboats, capable of holding somewhat more than half of the passengers and crew who would sail on her maiden voyage, and far fewer than the total she was designed to carry at full capacity. This was not, at the time, a violation of the law. The regulations governing lifeboats were old and out of date, written for ships far smaller than the Titanic, and they required a number of boats based on the ship's tonnage, rather than on the number of people it might carry. By those outdated rules, the Titanic actually carried more boats than were strictly required. The deeper problem lay in the assumption behind the rules and behind the whole design. It was assumed that a ship this large and this well-built would never truly need to evacuate everyone at once. The lifeboats were thought of not as a means of saving all aboard, but as a way of ferrying passengers to another vessel in the unlikely event of trouble, for it was believed that in the busy shipping lanes of the Atlantic, help would always be near at hand. The ship herself, it was thought, would be her own best lifeboat. These were the quiet assumptions built into the Titanic along with her steel, invisible as the rivets deep within her hull, unremarkable to almost everyone who saw her. And as the fitting out drew to a close in the early months of 1912, few gave them any thought at all. The eyes of the world were on the ship's magnificence, not on the gaps in her safety. She was beautiful, She was enormous. She was the newest wonder of a wondering age. By the spring of 1912, the Titanic was ready. In early April, she underwent her sea trials, a day of testing in which she left the shelter of Belfast and moved out into the open water to prove that her engines worked, that she could turn and stop, that all her systems performed as they should. She passed these trials and was certified as ready for service. Then she sailed from Belfast to the port of Southampton, on the southern coast of England, where she would take on the greater part of her passengers and crew and begin her first voyage across the Atlantic. She arrived at Southampton late at night and was brought into her berth, and there she waited through the days that followed as coal and provisions were loaded, as the crew was assembled, and as the first excitement of her presence spread through the town. Southampton in those days was a port town shaped by the sea and by the great liners that came and went. Many of its people made their living from the ships, and the arrival of the Titanic and the prospect of positions aboard her brought hope to countless local families. A great many of the crew who would sail on the maiden voyage were drawn from Southampton and its surrounding neighborhoods, ordinary working people, stewards and stewardesses, cooks and stokers, seamen and engineers who signed on for the voyage in the hope of steady wages. When we speak of the Titanic's crew, we are speaking largely of the people of this one English town, and when we speak of those who did not return, we are speaking of a wound that fell upon Southampton more heavily than upon any other place. A loss so widespread that in some streets scarcely a family was untouched. And so, in the early days of April, the great ship lay at her berth, gleaming in the spring light, her black hull rising sheer from the water, her 4 buff and black funnels tall against the sky, her deck stretching away longer than any street. Crowds came to look at her, drawn by the sight of something so new. Passengers who had booked their passage read of her splendors in the newspapers and imagined the voyage ahead. And in the quiet places of the ship, the crew made ready, checking the boilers and the engines, stocking the pantries and the linen rooms, preparing the cabins for the guests who would soon arrive. The world had built its greatest ship, and now it waited for her to sail. To understand the meaning of what was about to happen, we must hold in our minds this image of confidence and hope. Here was a vessel that represented the very summit of what the age believed itself capable of achieving. Here was the certainty that human skill had, at last, largely tamed the ancient danger of the sea. Here were more than 2,000 people, from the richest to the poorest, preparing to entrust their lives to that certainty, most of them thinking of the voyage not with fear but with anticipation, whether of a comfortable crossing among the fashionable or of a new beginning in a new land. The sea beyond the harbor was calm, the weather fair, the ship magnificent. There seemed to be no reason for anything but hope. And yet, far to the north and west, out on the open ocean, where the cold currents ran, the ice of that spring was already drifting south. It had broken from the glaciers of Greenland, as it did every year, and it moved silently down through the dark water, carried by currents older than any empire, indifferent to schedules and to pride, patient in the way that only the natural world can be. No one aboard the Titanic yet knew, and there was no reason they should have known, that the paths of the great ship and the drifting ice were slowly, quietly being drawn toward the same point in the vast and empty sea. For now, all was calm. For now, the story was still one of triumph, and the ship waited at her berth in the gentle April evening, her lights beginning to glow as the sky darkened, a palace of steel resting on the water, ready to carry her many lives out into the night. The morning of the 10th of April 1912 came clear and bright over Southampton, and with it came the passengers. From the early hours, the docks grew busy with the sounds of arrival, the clatter of carriages and motor cars, the calls of porters, the rumble of luggage carts, the murmur of many voices. The passengers came in waves that reflected the divisions of the ship itself. The wealthy arrived in comfort, some having traveled down from London by a special train that ran directly to the dock, stepping from their carriages in their fine clothes, followed by servants and by trunks full of belongings. The middle sort came with their families and their modest baggage, dressed in their best for the occasion. And the emigrants came in the greatest numbers, carrying what they owned in cases and bundles, many of them setting foot for the first time upon so grand a vessel, gazing up at the towering black hull with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. Before boarding, the third-class passengers in particular were subject to inspection. The shipping companies were required to check emigrants for signs of illness, for the United States would turn back any traveler judged unfit to enter, and the cost of returning such a person fell upon the company that had carried them. So the emigrants passed through examinations, their eyes and skin checked for signs of disease, their papers reviewed, before they were allowed to climb the gangways into the ship. For these travelers, the voyage was not a holiday but a passage between two lives, and one can imagine the weight of feeling they carried as they boarded, the mixture of grief at leaving behind everything familiar and hope for what might lie ahead. Once aboard, the passengers dispersed into their separate worlds. The first-class travelers were shown to their staterooms by attentive stewards, and they explored the grand rooms that had been prepared for them, the sweeping staircase, the elegant lounges, the promenades where they could stroll and watch the sea. Among them were some of the wealthiest and most prominent people of the age. There were industrialists and financiers whose fortunes ran into sums almost beyond imagining. There were members of old and distinguished families and prosperous businessmen, and their wives adorned in the fashions of the day. There were also figures connected to the ship herself, including the chairman of the White Star Line, who traveled aboard the maiden voyage to observe his company's new triumph, and the man who had overseen much of the ship's design and construction on behalf of the builders who came along to note any small improvements that might be made. The presence of these men aboard added to the sense of occasion, for the maiden voyage of the Titanic was, in every sense, a showcase. Among the second-class passengers were people of quieter, but no less interesting lives, teachers and clergymen, engineers and businessmen of moderate means, families moving for work or for a fresh start, elderly couples traveling to visit relatives across the sea. And among the third class were the hundreds of ordinary people whose names, for the most part, would never have been recorded in any history had it not been for what befell them. There were young Irish men and women leaving the countryside for the cities of America, groups of friends and relatives traveling together, whole families setting out to join fathers or brothers who had gone ahead. There were Scandinavians and Finns, Lebanese and Syrians, Bulgarians and Croatians, and people of many other lands, each carrying their own particular hopes, their own reasons for crossing the sea. Let us pause and think about what it meant to board such a ship, for it is one of the small human truths that history often forgets. For the emigrant in third class, the Titanic was extraordinary beyond anything in ordinary experience. Many of these travelers came from villages where life had changed little for centuries, where the rhythms of the day were set by the seasons and the church bells, where the largest building might be a stone church and the fastest thing a running horse. To such a person, the Titanic was a marvel almost beyond comprehension, a moving building filled with electric light, with running water, with more food than they had perhaps ever seen, with corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. Some of them wandered the decks in a kind of amazement, taking in a world utterly unlike the one they had left. There was, in these first hours, a great deal of simple happiness aboard the ship. The happiness of people setting out on a great adventure, most of them entirely unafraid. The departure itself came in the early afternoon. As the hour approached, the great ropes that held the ship to the dock were cast off, and tugs began to draw her out into the channel. And here occurred a small incident that some would later remember as a shadow across the day, though at the time it was quickly forgotten. As the Titanic moved through the harbor, the water she displaced with her enormous bulk caused a smaller liner, moored nearby, to strain against its ropes. The ropes snapped, and the smaller ship began to swing outward, drawn toward the passing Titanic, until for a moment it seemed the two vessels might collide. Quick action by the tugs and by the Titanic's crew, and a burst of the engines, drew the great ship clear, and the danger passed. The Titanic continued out of the harbor without harm, yet those who saw it could not help but feel a flicker of unease, that the mighty ship had so very nearly begun her career with an accident. Clear of Southampton, the Titanic made her way across the English Channel to the French port of Cherbourg, where she arrived in the evening. The harbor at Cherbourg was not deep enough to receive so large a ship at a dock, so the Titanic anchored offshore, and passengers were carried out to her by smaller vessels called tenders. Here more travelers came aboard, including some of the wealthiest passengers of the entire voyage, along with a number of emigrants from various lands who had made their way to France to take ship. As the light faded over the French coast, the tenders drew alongside. The new passengers climbed aboard with their luggage, and the Titanic took on the last of her continental travelers before turning to the sea once more. From Cherbourg she sailed westward through the night and arrived the next day, the 11th of April, at her final port of call, the town of Queenstown on the southern coast of Ireland, known today as Cobb. Once again the harbor could not accommodate the ship directly, and once again tenders carried passengers out to her, where she lay at anchor in the lovely bay, with the green Irish hills rising behind the town and the tall spire of a cathedral standing above the harbor. Here the last of the passengers came aboard, most of them Irish emigrants leaving their homeland for America, joining the many of their countrymen already in the ship. For these travelers, Queenstown was the last of Ireland they would ever see, and many of them stood at the rails watching the coast as the ship prepared to depart, looking back at the land of their birth with feelings we can only imagine. Some carried in their memories the faces of family left behind on the dock, parents grown old, children too young to travel, friends who had come to see them off. The parting of emigrants from their homeland was one of the great sorrows of that age, repeated countless times in countless ports, and on the Titanic that day it was repeated once more. In the early afternoon of the 11th of April, the Titanic weighed anchor at Queenstown and turned her bow toward the open Atlantic. Behind her lay Europe, the old world with all its history and its hardship. Ahead lay nearly 3,000 miles of ocean, and beyond that, the shores of America and the promise of a new beginning. The last tender pulled away, carrying with it the mail, and a small number of people who had come aboard only for the short passage from Southampton, and who now returned to shore. As the ship gathered speed and moved out past the headlands, the coast of Ireland slipped slowly astern, growing fainter and lower on the horizon, until at last it sank from view entirely, and there was nothing all around but the wide gray sea. The days that followed from the 11th to the 14th of April were days of pleasant and uneventful sailing. The weather, for the most part, was fine, the sea calm, the ship performing beautifully. Life aboard settled into a comfortable routine, and for those days the Titanic was exactly what she had been built to be, a floating world of comfort and order, carrying her passengers smoothly across the ocean. It is worth dwelling on these ordinary days, for they represent the Titanic as she was meant to be remembered, and as too few remember her, a triumph of human craft functioning perfectly, a place of warmth and light and human society moving across the cold indifference of the sea. Consider a day aboard the ship. In the first class, passengers woke in their comfortable staterooms and were brought morning refreshment by their stewards. They breakfasted in the elegant dining saloon, choosing from a great variety of dishes. The morning might be spent strolling on the promenade decks, reading in the library, or writing letters in the reading and writing room. Some of the more energetic used the exercise equipment, or the swimming bath or the Turkish bath. There was a barber shop, and a dark room for those who wished to develop their photographs, and shops where one could purchase small necessities. Lunch was another elaborate affair, and the afternoon might pass in conversation, in cards, or in simply watching the endless sea slide by. As evening approached, the passengers dressed for dinner in their finest clothes, the men in formal evening dress, the ladies in gowns and jewels, and they descended the grand staircase to dine in splendor while the ship's musicians played. After dinner, the men might retire to the smoking room with cigars and brandy, while the ladies gathered in the lounge, and the day would close in comfortable companionship. The second-class passengers passed their days more quietly, but no less pleasantly, reading in their own library, walking on their own promenade, taking their meals in their own dining room, and gathering in the evenings for conversation, and at times for hymn singing, for many of these travelers were religious people who found comfort in familiar songs. On the last evening of the voyage, A group of second-class passengers is said to have gathered for such a service of hymns, singing the old and beloved songs of faith, including one that spoke of those in peril on the sea, a detail that later took on a mournful significance in the memory of the disaster. The third-class passengers, too, made their own society in the lower decks. Here the mood was often the liveliest of all, for these were people setting out on the greatest adventure of their lives, and among them there was music and dancing and laughter. Someone would bring out a fiddle or a set of pipes or an accordion, and there would be dancing in the common spaces, the old dances of Ireland and of the many other lands the passengers came from. Children played in the corridors and on the open decks. Friendships formed quickly among strangers thrown together by the voyage, and the shared excitement of the journey to America created bonds among people who had never met before and would, in the ordinary course of things, have parted forever at the journey's end. In these lower decks was a great deal of the true life of the ship, ordinary human warmth of the kind that has always existed among people traveling together toward an uncertain future. And below even these decks, in the hot and roaring spaces near the bottom of the ship, another world entirely labored day and night to keep the great vessel moving. Here were the boiler rooms, where the firemen and stokers worked in shifts around the clock, shoveling coal into the furnaces that heated the boilers that made the steam that turned the engines. This was among the hardest labor aboard, performed in heat and noise and coal dust, far below the waterline, out of sight of the passengers who enjoyed the fruits of it. The men who did this work were tough and weathered, accustomed to the harsh conditions of the stokehold, and they took a certain pride in their strength and endurance. Alongside them worked the engineers, skilled men who tended the great machinery, and the trimmers who moved coal from the bunkers to the furnaces. This hidden world of labor was the true heart of the ship, the source of all her motion, and its workers were as essential to the voyage as any captain or millionaire above. Over all of this presided the ship's captain, a man of long experience and great reputation, one of the most senior and respected commanders in the White Star Line, who had been chosen to command the maiden voyage as a mark of honor, and who was said to be nearing the end of his career, so that this voyage was expected to be among his last before retirement. He was a figure of calm authority, well liked by passengers and crew alike, a seaman of many years who had crossed the Atlantic countless times. Under his command served a large crew of officers, seamen, engineers, and stewards, each with their own duties, all working to keep the great and complex machine of the ship running smoothly. For 4 days they succeeded admirably. The Titanic sailed on, the days passed in comfort, and the confidence of the age seemed entirely justified. Yet, as the ship moved westward, she was entering the northern waters where the ice drifted, and here the story begins to gather toward its turning point, quietly and without alarm. Throughout the 12th, 13th, and 14th of April, the Titanic's wireless operators received messages from other ships in the area, some of which carried warnings of ice in the vicinity, of icebergs and field ice sighted along the route ahead. The wireless, or radio, was still a new technology in those years, and its use aboard ship was not yet fully organized into a strict system of safety. The wireless operators aboard the Titanic were employed by the company that provided the equipment, and much of their time was spent not on ship's business, but on sending and receiving personal messages for the wealthy passengers, who found it a novelty and a pleasure to send greetings to friends on land or on other ships. The ice warnings that came in were, in some cases, passed along to the officers on the bridge, and in some cases, it seems, they were not passed along promptly or with sufficient emphasis, being treated as routine among the many messages flowing in and out. This is one of the quiet tragedies woven through the story of that night, that the danger was known, in a general way, and yet the knowledge did not translate into the caution it might have. Ice warnings were, in that era, a normal part of an Atlantic crossing in the spring. Ships received them regularly, and for the most part continued on their way, adjusting course perhaps, but rarely slowing much, trusting to the vigilance of the lookouts and the strength of the ship to see them through. There was, in the practice of the time, a widespread assumption that a large and well-handled ship could safely navigate through ice-strewn waters at speed, so long as a sharp watch was kept, for it was believed that any iceberg would be seen in time to avoid it. This assumption, like so many others surrounding the Titanic, would prove tragically mistaken on the particular conditions of that particular night. For the night of the 14th of April brought together a set of circumstances that conspired against the ship in a way that no one could easily have foreseen. The weather was exceptionally clear, the sky brilliant with stars, the air bitterly cold, for the temperature had been dropping through the evening as the ship moved into colder waters, and the sea was extraordinarily calm, so calm that its surface was almost like glass, without the usual swell that causes waves to break against the base of an iceberg. This calmness, which might seem a blessing, was in fact a danger, for it meant that there was no line of white foam at the waterline of any iceberg to make it visible in the darkness. An iceberg on a normal night with some swell running would betray itself by the breaking of water at its base, a pale ring against the dark, but on a sea as flat as this, an iceberg could rise from the water almost invisibly, a shape only slightly darker than the darkness around it, until it was very close indeed. Furthermore, there was no moon that night. The stars shone with great brilliance, but they gave little light upon the surface of the sea, and the water and the sky merged into a single darkness at the horizon. The lookouts, stationed high in the crow's nest on the forward mast, peered into this darkness as the ship drove on, and they had not even been provided with binoculars, which through some oversight had gone missing or been misplaced during the voyage, though it is debated whether binoculars would have helped in such conditions, for they narrow the field of view and can make it harder to scan the sea. The lookouts relied on their own eyes, straining into the cold and starlit dark, watching for anything that might loom ahead, and the ship was moving fast. Through the evening, the Titanic had been sailing at close to her full speed, driving westward across the calm sea toward America, in accordance with the ordinary practice of the day and the desire to maintain a good crossing time. There has long been discussion among historians as to whether there was any deliberate attempt to set a speed record or to arrive ahead of schedule. The evidence suggests that the ship was simply doing what such ships did, maintaining a high speed as was normal, without any reckless intent, but also without slowing in response to the ice warnings, as a more cautious approach might have counseled. In the temper of the times, to slow down for ice was not the expected thing, unless the ice was actually in sight, and so the great ship rushed on through the dark, at a speed that would leave little time to react to any sudden danger. As the night deepened, the cold grew intense. In the boiler rooms below, the stokers labored in the heat, but on the open decks above, the few passengers still about hurried to the warmth of the interior, and by the late hours the promenades were nearly deserted. Most of the passengers had retired to their cabins for the night, the first-class travelers to their comfortable beds, the emigrants to their bunks in the lower decks. The ship was quiet now, most of her lights dimmed, the music stilled, the dancing ended. Only the watch remained alert, the officers on the bridge, the lookouts in the crow's nest, the engineers and stokers below, the wireless operators at their instruments. The great ship moved on through the perfect deadly calm, her lights a small constellation of human warmth in the vast dark emptiness of the North Atlantic, and around her, unseen, the ice drifted silently upon the still black water. To those aboard who were awake, there was nothing to suggest that anything was wrong. The voyage had been beautiful. The ship was performing perfectly. In 2 or 3 more days they would reach New York, and the maiden voyage of the greatest ship in the world would be complete, a triumph to be celebrated. The passengers slept, or read, or talked quietly in the few rooms still occupied, wrapped in the comfort and safety that the Titanic seemed so completely to promise. There was no fear aboard that night, no premonition, no sense of the nearness of danger. There was only the calm, the cold, the stars, and the steady vibration of the engines, carrying them all onward through the dark. And so the story moves quietly toward its turning point, not with any warning or any sign, but in the ordinary peace of a beautiful night at sea. The ship that could not sink sailed on across the smoothest of seas beneath the brightest of skies, carrying more than 2,000 sleeping and waking souls. all of them trusting in the steel around them and the skill of the men who guided them. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, a mountain of ice broken from a glacier far to the north and drifting for months upon the currents, floated silently in the path of the ship. Neither could be blamed for what was to come. The ice had no will, and the men aboard had no ill intent. It was simply that the paths of the ship and the ice, drawn together over all those miles of ocean, were now about to meet at a particular point, at a particular moment, on the calmest and clearest and coldest of nights. It was near 20 minutes before midnight when the lookout high in the crow's nest saw it. Out of the darkness ahead, a shape rose against the stars, darker than the night, a mass looming directly in the ship's path. He rang the warning bell 3 times, the signal for danger ahead, and he took up the telephone that connected the crow's nest to the bridge. And when it was answered, he spoke the words that would echo through history in their simple plainness, that there was ice directly ahead. On the bridge, the officer of the watch reacted at once, giving the orders to turn the ship and to reverse the engines, and the great wheel was spun hard over, and the machinery below strained to obey. For a long and terrible moment the ship seemed not to respond, for a vessel of such size cannot turn quickly, and the iceberg drew closer. Then, slowly, the bow began to swing to one side away from the ice. For an instant it seemed that the ship might clear it altogether, that the great mass would slide past the bow and away into the dark, and in a sense, the ship very nearly did clear it. The bow swung clear, but the iceberg was enormous, far larger beneath the water than above, and as the ship slid past, the submerged portion of the ice scraped along her side below the waterline. There was no great crash, no violent collision that threw people from their feet. Most of those aboard felt only a faint shudder, a grinding tremor that passed through the ship, a sound like a distant tearing or a heavy vibration. Some passengers, awake in their cabins, wondered idly what it might have been, and then thought no more of it. Some who were near the point of contact saw ice tumble onto the forward decks. Chunks and fragments knocked from the berg as the ship brushed against it. A few of the crew and passengers even played briefly with the ice on the deck, unaware of what it signified. To almost everyone aboard, the moment passed as a small and curious event, hardly worth waking for. But below the waterline, along the starboard side of the ship, the ice had done its work. The collision had not torn a single great hole in the hull, as was once imagined, but had instead caused the hull plates to buckle and the seams between them to open, along a length of the ship far greater than anyone realized in those first moments. Water began to pour in through these openings, into compartment after compartment near the bow, more compartments than the ship could survive losing. In the first minutes, only a few people understood what this meant. The captain came quickly to the bridge, and the ship was stopped, and the man who had overseen her design was summoned to assess the damage. Together they went below or received the reports, and gradually the truth became clear to them. A truth that must have been almost impossible to accept. The ship was doomed. The water had entered too many of the forward compartments, and because the watertight bulkheads did not rise high enough, the water, as it filled the bow and drew it down, would spill over the tops of the bulkheads from one compartment to the next, in exactly the manner that had been thought too unlikely to matter. There was no way to stop it. The pumps, however hard they worked, could not remove water faster than it came in. Slowly but with absolute certainty, the Titanic would fill and sink. Those who understood the mathematics of it also understood something more dreadful still, that there were lifeboats for barely half the people aboard, and that the nearest ships that might come to help were hours away. In the space of a few minutes, in the quiet of that beautiful night, the men on the bridge came to know that a great many of the people sleeping trustfully around them were going to die. What followed over the next 2.5 hours is one of the most closely studied episodes in modern history, and also one of the most human, for it reveals, in the extremity of the situation, the whole range of human character, the noble and the frightened, the brave and the bewildered, the selfish and the selfless. Let us walk through it slowly, with care and with respect for those who lived and died within it, remembering always that these were real people, Ordinary men, women, and children caught in a catastrophe. None of them had chosen. The captain gave the orders that the situation demanded. The lifeboats were to be uncovered and made ready. The passengers were to be roused and brought up to the boat deck with their life belts on. And the wireless operators were to send out calls for help to any ship that might hear them. These calls went out into the night, giving the ship's position and the message that she was sinking and required immediate assistance. The operators sent the older distress signal, and also the newer one that had recently come into use, tapping out their appeals again and again into the dark. Several ships heard the calls, but most were too far away to reach the Titanic in time. There was, tragically, at least one ship thought to have been much closer, whose lights some aboard the Titanic believed they could see on the horizon, but which did not come, for reasons that have been debated ever since, most likely because its own wireless operator had gone to bed, and its watch did not understand the distress signals that the Titanic tried to send by other means, including rockets fired into the sky. This nearby ship, whose identity and conduct became the subject of great controversy, might have saved many lives had it responded, and the thought of its lights shining so close while the Titanic sank has haunted the memory of the disaster ever since. Meanwhile, one ship far to the southeast, upon receiving the distress call, turned at once and drove through the ice-strewn night at the greatest speed it could manage, its crew working desperately to reach the sinking liner. This was the Carpathia, and its captain took great risks, racing through the same dangerous waters to come to the aid of the Titanic. But the Carpathia was many miles away, and even at full speed it could not arrive for some 4 hours. The Titanic did not have 4 hours. And so, though help was coming, it would come too late for most of those aboard. On the boat deck, the work of loading the lifeboats began. Here, the true difficulty of the situation revealed itself, not only in the shortage of boats, but in the confusion and disbelief of the passengers. For a long time, many of those aboard simply could not comprehend that the great ship was truly sinking. She seemed so vast, so solid, so safe. The night was calm, the decks were steady, the lights still burned brightly, and the idea that this magnificent vessel could actually go down beneath them seemed absurd. Many passengers were reluctant to leave the warmth and apparent safety of the ship, to climb into small open boats, and be lowered down the towering side into the black and freezing sea. Some refused at first to board the boats at all, preferring to remain aboard the ship they could not believe was in danger. And so, in the early stages, several of the lifeboats were lowered only partly filled, carrying far fewer people than they could have held, a loss that would later be counted among the most painful failures of that night, for those empty places might have meant lives saved. The officers in charge of loading the boats followed, in the main, the principle that women and children should be placed in them first. This was the code of the age, the unwritten law of the sea and of the society that had built the ship, that in a disaster the men should stand back and give the places to the women and the children. On the whole, this principle was followed, though not without exceptions and not without confusion, and the manner in which it was applied varied from one part of the ship to another and from one officer to another. On one side of the ship, the officer in charge interpreted the order strictly, allowing only women and children into the boats, and turning away men even when places remained. On the other side, the officer allowed men to board if no women or children were waiting. These differences of interpretation meant that the fate of individuals often depended on which side of the deck they happened to be. One of the many cruel accidents of chance that determined who lived and who died. Throughout the ship, the crew worked to wake the passengers and guide them upward. The stewards went along the corridors, knocking on doors, telling people to dress warmly, to put on their life belts, to come up to the boat deck. In the first-class areas, this was done with relative order, and the passengers, though anxious, were guided toward the boats. In the lower decks, where the emigrants were housed, the situation was more difficult and more tragic. These passengers were far from the boat deck, deep in the ship, in a maze of corridors and stairways they did not know well. Many did not speak English, and could not easily understand the instructions given to them. Some of the gates and barriers that ordinarily separated the third class from the upper decks, in accordance with the regulations of the time, contributed to delays in these passengers reaching the boats. though the exact degree to which they were deliberately held back, as opposed to simply lost and delayed in the confusion, remains a matter of historical debate. What is clear is that the third-class passengers who made up so large a portion of those aboard suffered proportionally the greatest losses, and that the divisions of class that had shaped the ship in life shaped it also in death. Let us pause here, in the midst of the sinking, to remember that all of this took place with a strange and terrible outward calm. At least in the early stages, there was no immediate panic. The band, the ship's musicians, gathered and began to play, first in one of the lounges and then out on the deck, and they continued to play as the ship sank, offering music into the freezing night as a kind of comfort and a kind of courage. The story of the band playing on has become one of the enduring images of the disaster. And though the details of exactly what they played and until what moment have been debated, it seems certain that they did play, and that their music was heard by many as the boats were loaded and lowered. It is one of the strangest and most moving details of that night, that in the face of certain death, these men chose to keep playing, filling the darkness with melody so that those around them might feel a little less alone. There were countless small acts of courage and of love that night, and also, it must be said, moments of fear and of failure, for people are not all one thing. There were husbands who helped their wives and children into the boats, and then stepped back to die, having said their goodbyes with a calm that must have cost them everything. There were elderly couples who chose to remain together rather than be parted, the wife refusing to leave her husband, choosing to stay and face the end at his side rather than save herself alone. There were men who gave up their places, and men who tried to save themselves, and crew members who worked to the last to load the boats and maintain order, and others who were overwhelmed. There were mothers who were separated from their children in the confusion, and children who were passed from hand to hand into the boats, while their parents remained behind. Every one of these was a real human moment, a real person facing the most terrible of choices in the space of a few minutes, in the cold and the dark, with the ship sinking beneath them. As the night wore on, the bow of the ship sank lower and lower into the water, and the reality of the situation became impossible to deny. The forward decks began to slip beneath the surface. The angle of the ship grew steeper. Now the calm of the early stages began to give way, as those still aboard understood that the boats were nearly all gone, and that there would be no room for most of them. The last boats were loaded and lowered in greater haste and greater desperation. When the lifeboats were gone, there remained aboard the ship still well over 1,000 people, with no means of escape but the freezing water itself, which was so cold that a person immersed in it could survive only a short time before the cold overcame them. In the final minutes, the scene aboard the ship became one of great and terrible drama, which out of respect and out of care for the calm of this telling, we will not dwell upon in painful detail. The stern of the ship rose high into the air as the bow sank, until the great vessel stood at a steep angle, her lights still burning and then flickering and then going out. The immense strain upon her structure was too great, and at some point in these final moments the ship broke apart, the hull splitting between the stern and the bow, a fact that was long debated but was confirmed when the wreck was finally discovered, lying in two great pieces upon the ocean floor. The bow section, already full of water, sank away first, and the stern settled back for a moment before it too filled and slid beneath the surface. And then, in the space of a few moments, the greatest ship in the world was gone, vanished beneath the calm black water, leaving behind only the lifeboats scattered across the sea, the wreckage floating upon the surface, and the many people who had gone into the water. It was now a little after 2 o'clock in the morning on the 15th of April. The Titanic, which had sailed from Southampton only 5 days before amid such confidence and such celebration, was gone, sunk in the deep waters of the North Atlantic. The night was still clear, still bitterly cold, still brilliant with stars. The sea, which had been so calm all night, closed over the place where the ship had been and grew calm again, as though nothing had happened at all. The lifeboats, holding those who had been saved, drifted upon the dark water, their occupants stunned and grieving, listening to the sounds that came across the water from those in the sea. and then, gradually, to the silence that followed as the cold took them. It is among the most sorrowful passages in the whole story. This time of waiting in the boats, in the cold and the dark, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the ocean, and we will pass over it gently, honoring those who endured it and those who did not survive. Most of the lifeboats, once they had pulled away from the sinking ship, did not return to pick up those in the water, for fear of being swamped or overturned by the many desperate people who would try to climb aboard. This decision, understandable in the terror of the moment, meant that many who might have been saved were not, and the question of whether more could have been done to rescue those in the water became one of the sorrowful debates that followed the disaster. A few boats did return and pulled some survivors from the sea, but by the time they came back, most of those in the water had already succumbed to the cold. Of the more than 2,000 people who had sailed aboard the Titanic, only around 700 survived, carried in the lifeboats through the remaining hours of the night. More than 1,500 were lost. Through the last dark hours before dawn, the survivors in the lifeboats waited, not knowing whether any help would come. They were cold, many of them inadequately dressed, exposed to the freezing air, some of them in shock, many of them grieving for husbands, fathers, sons, and friends left behind. They rowed to keep warm, or sat huddled together, or called out to other boats in the darkness. Some sang, or prayed, or simply waited in silence, watching the eastern horizon for any sign of rescue. And then, at last, as the sky began to lighten toward dawn, they saw lights approaching across the sea. The Carpathia had arrived. The Carpathia had raced through the night at great risk, and it came upon the scene of the disaster in the early morning light, to find the lifeboats scattered across a sea now dotted with drifting ice, the great icebergs standing pale and silent in the growing light, monuments of indifferent nature upon the place of so much human sorrow. One by one, the Carpathia drew alongside the lifeboats and took the survivors aboard, lifting them from the small boats up onto the deck of the rescue ship, wrapping them in blankets, giving them warmth and food and comfort. The crew and passengers of the Carpathia did all they could for the survivors, tending to them with great kindness. But even as they were saved, the survivors were only beginning to comprehend the scale of what had happened, and the ship became a place of terrible grief, filled with people searching among the rescued for loved ones who were not there, and slowly coming to understand that those loved ones were gone. When all the survivors had been gathered aboard, and it was clear that there were no more to be found, the Carpathia turned and made its way back toward New York, carrying the 700 survivors of the Titanic away from the place of the disaster. Behind them, the sea grew quiet once more, the icebergs drifted on, and the place where the great ship had gone down showed no sign of what had occurred there, only the endless water and the empty sky. Far below, more than 2 miles beneath the surface, the Titanic came to rest upon the ocean floor, in the cold and the eternal dark, where she would lie undisturbed and unseen for more than 70 years. The news of the disaster reached the world slowly and confusedly at first. In the early reports, there was great uncertainty about what had happened, and some early accounts even suggested, wrongly, that all the passengers had been saved, and that the ship was being towed to safety. It was only as the hours passed, and more accurate information came through, that the terrible truth became known, that the Titanic had sunk, and that most of those aboard had perished. When the Carpathia neared New York, an enormous crowd gathered at the dock to await her arrival. Families and friends of the passengers, reporters, and the curious, all straining for news. And when the ship arrived in the rain and the dark of the evening, and the survivors came ashore, the reality of the loss struck home with full force. There were joyful reunions for the fortunate few whose loved ones had survived, and there was unbearable grief for the many whose loved ones had not. The town of Southampton, from which so many of the crew had come, was plunged into mourning, for the losses among the crew had been heavy, and scarcely a street in the working neighborhoods was untouched by death. And so, the story moves quietly forward, from the disaster itself to the long reckoning that followed. For the sinking of the Titanic was not only a human tragedy of enormous scale, It was also a profound shock to the confidence of the age, a blow to the belief that human skill had conquered nature, and that the marvels of the modern world were beyond the reach of catastrophe, that the greatest and most advanced ship ever built, the very symbol of the age's achievement, should be destroyed on its first voyage by a piece of drifting ice, and that so many should die for want of enough lifeboats, forced people to confront the limits of their confidence and the consequences of their assumptions. The disaster became, almost at once, more than an event. It became a lesson, a warning, and a legend. In the weeks and months after the disaster, the world sought to understand what had happened and why, and to ensure, as far as possible, that such a thing could never happen again. Investigations were held on both sides of the Atlantic, one in the United States and one in Britain, in which the survivors, the crew, and the experts were questioned at length, and the events of that night were examined in painstaking detail. These inquiries were, in their way, an attempt to make sense of the incomprehensible, to trace the chain of decisions and circumstances that had led to so great a loss of life, and to assign, where appropriate, responsibility and reform. The inquiries brought to light many of the failings we have already touched upon. They examined the shortage of lifeboats and the outdated regulations that had permitted so large a ship to sail with boats for barely half those aboard. They examined the speed at which the ship had been traveling through waters known to contain ice, and the ice warnings that had been received but not fully heeded. They examined the conduct of the nearby ship that had failed to come to the Titanic's aid, and the confusion over its identity and its actions, a matter that remained bitterly contested. They examined the loading of the lifeboats, and the reasons why so many had been lowered only partly filled, and they examined the whole set of assumptions that had surrounded the ship, the belief in her near unsinkability that had, in a sense, contributed to the very complacency that made the disaster so deadly. Out of these inquiries came real and lasting changes, and this is one of the ways in which the loss of the Titanic, terrible as it was, came to have a meaning beyond the tragedy itself. New regulations were introduced requiring that ships carry enough lifeboats for every person aboard. A change that seems so obvious in hindsight that it is painful to realize it had not been the law before. Requirements were established for regular lifeboat drills so that crews and passengers would know what to do in an emergency. Rules were introduced regarding the use of wireless equipment, requiring that ships maintain a continuous watch on the radio at all hours, so that a distress call could never again go unheard because the operator had gone to bed, as had happened with the ship that failed to come to the Titanic's aid. And an international patrol was established to monitor the ice in the North Atlantic shipping lanes and to warn ships of its presence. A patrol that continues its work to this day, more than a century later, a quiet and enduring legacy of the disaster. Every ship that crosses the North Atlantic in safety through the ice season owes something to the lessons learned at such a cost on that April night. These reforms did not, of course, bring back the dead, nor could they undo the grief of the thousands of families touched by the loss, but they meant that the deaths of those aboard the Titanic were not entirely without consequence, that from the tragedy came changes that would save countless lives in the years to come. There is a certain solemn comfort in this, that the suffering of that night was turned, at least in part, toward the protection of those who would sail after. The people who died aboard the Titanic became, in a sense, the unwilling teachers of a hard lesson that the age had been unwilling to learn any other way. Beyond the practical reforms, the disaster left a deep and lasting mark upon the imagination of the world. Almost from the moment the news broke, the sinking of the Titanic began to take on the quality of a legend, a story told and retold, examined from every angle, invested with meaning far beyond the bare facts of the event. It seemed to many people to carry a lesson about pride, about the dangers of overconfidence, about the limits of human power in the face of nature. The image of the great unsinkable ship brought low by a piece of ice, on its very first voyage in the calmest of seas, struck people as almost unbearably poignant, a kind of parable made real. Poets and writers took up the theme, and the disaster entered the culture of the age as a symbol, a warning against the hubris of a civilization that had come to believe too much in its own invincibility. There is a strange and often noted detail connected to this sense of the Titanic as a parable of pride. Some years before the disaster, a writer had published a work of fiction describing the sinking of an enormous ocean liner, believed to be unsinkable, which strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic on an April night and goes down with great loss of life for want of enough lifeboats. And the fictional ship in this story bore a name remarkably similar to the Titanic. The coincidence when it was noticed after the disaster seemed to many almost uncanny, as though the tragedy had somehow been foreseen. In truth, it was most likely a coincidence, born of the fact that the writer understood the conditions and dangers of Atlantic travel and imagined a plausible disaster, and that the real dangers he described were the very ones that in time befell the Titanic. But the coincidence added to the sense that the disaster carried some deeper significance, some quality of fate about it, and it has been retold countless times as one of the eerie footnotes to the story. For the survivors, the disaster did not end with their rescue. They carried it with them for the rest of their lives. The memory of that night, the loss of loved ones, the strange and heavy burden of having lived when so many others died. Many of them rarely spoke of it, finding the memory too painful to revisit. Others became, in time, the keepers of the story, sharing their accounts with those who wished to understand what had happened. The last of the survivors, who had been a small child at the time of the sinking and could have had no real memory of it, lived on until the early years of the 21st century, so that for nearly a century there was always someone alive who had been aboard the Titanic on that night. And then, at last, of them was gone, and the disaster passed entirely out of living memory and into history. But the ship herself remained, down in the dark, though for a long time no one knew exactly where. For decades after the sinking, the wreck of the Titanic lay undiscovered upon the ocean floor, its precise location uncertain, far beyond the reach of the technology of the time. People dreamed of finding her, of raising her even, though the depth at which she lay made any such recovery impossible. She became, in a sense, a lost thing, a legend resting somewhere in the vast dark deep, her exact grave unknown, and there she remained undisturbed through the long decades of the 20th century, through wars and changes that transformed the world above. While below, in the cold and the silence, the great ship slowly settled into the sediment of the ocean floor, colonized by the strange creatures of the deep, rusting slowly in the endless dark. Then, in the autumn of 1985, more than 70 years after the sinking, an expedition led by a team of ocean scientists finally found her, using advanced underwater technology, including a small remotely operated vehicle that could descend to the great depths and send back images. The searchers located the wreck of the Titanic, lying more than 12,000 feet below the surface, in two main pieces, the bow and the stern separated by a great field of debris. The scattered belongings and fragments of the ship spread across the ocean floor between them. The moment of discovery was one of great emotion for those involved, for they were the first human eyes to look upon the Titanic since she had vanished beneath the waves so long before. The images they sent back of the great bow rising from the mud, of the rusting decks and the fallen masts, of the everyday objects lying scattered in the debris field, brought the reality of the disaster home to a new generation in a way that no written account could. The discovery of the wreck opened a new chapter in the long story of the Titanic, and it raised difficult questions of its own. For the wreck was not merely an object of scientific and historical interest. It was also a grave, the final resting place of many of the 1,500 who had died, and there were those who felt strongly that it should be left undisturbed, treated with the reverence due to a place of death. Others argued for the recovery of objects from the debris field, both to study them and to preserve them, and in the years that followed, many artifacts were brought up from the wreck site, the personal belongings and fittings of the ship, which were conserved and displayed in exhibitions that allowed people to see and to feel a connection to the reality of the disaster. This work has been controversial, and the tension between the desire to study and remember and the desire to let the dead rest in peace has never been fully resolved. It is one of the quiet dilemmas that surround the wreck, and there is no easy answer to it. The images and studies of the wreck have also taught us much about how the ship actually sank, confirming, as we noted, that she broke apart before going down, and revealing the extent of the damage and the manner of her descent. The wreck itself is slowly deteriorating, consumed by the rusticles, the strange formations created by the microbes that feed upon the iron of the hull, so that in time, perhaps within a century or two, the ship will largely collapse and dissolve back into the sea, leaving only the more durable objects scattered upon the floor. In this slow dissolution there is something fitting, a return of the great ship to the elements from which she was made, a final and gradual laying to rest. The Titanic, which was built to last and to conquer the sea, is being reclaimed by the sea, gently and inexorably, over the long span of years. Let us step back now, away from the wreck in its cold deep, and think about what the story of the Titanic has come to mean, and why it continues to hold such a place in the memory of the world more than a century after that April night. For of all the many disasters and tragedies of history, some far greater in the number of lives lost, few have captured the human imagination so completely or so lastingly as the sinking of the Titanic. There must be reasons for this, reasons worth pondering in the quiet of the night. Part of it, surely, is the sheer drama of the contrast, the fall from such height to such depth, the greatest ship in the world, the pride of the age, destroyed on its first voyage. In the calmest of seas by the oldest and most natural of dangers. Part of it is the completeness of the story, the way it contains within it, in the space of a single night, the whole range of human experience, wealth and poverty, courage and fear, love and loss, chance and choice. Part of it is the way the ship served as a kind of mirror of its society, with its divisions of class laid out from top to bottom, so that the disaster became a story not only of a shipwreck but of a whole world, a whole age, caught in a moment of crisis. And part of it, perhaps, is simply the human faces within it, the real people whose stories have come down to us, the husbands and wives, the parents and children, the crew and the passengers, each of whom was a whole world of hopes and fears, most of whom we can never fully know, but all of whom were real, and all of whom were caught up in something far larger than themselves. There is also, in the story of the Titanic, a quality that speaks to something deep in the human heart, a meditation on impermanence and on the limits of human power. The age that built the Titanic believed, as we have seen, in the almost unlimited power of human skill and human progress. The ship was the very embodiment of that belief, a demonstration that humanity had grown strong enough to build a floating palace and to cross the great ocean in comfort and safety. And the disaster was, in a sense, a reminder that this belief, however justified in many respects, had its limits, that nature remained more powerful than any human creation, that the sea remained what it had always been, vast and cold and indifferent to human ambition. There is a humility in this lesson, a recognition of the smallness of even our greatest works against the enormity of the world that has always resonated with those who hear the story. And yet the story of the Titanic is not only a story of pride brought low, nor only a story of loss. It is also a story of the reforms that followed, of the lives saved in later years, because of the lessons learned, of the ways in which human beings responded to catastrophe by making the world a little safer. It is a story of the courage and love shown by many aboard in their final hours, of the men who gave up their places, of the couples who chose to stay together, of the musicians who played on into the freezing dark. It is a story of the rescue of the Carpathia racing through the night to save those it could, of the kindness shown to the survivors. And it is a story of memory, of the way the world has chosen to remember those who were lost, to study and to honor them, to keep their story alive across the generations. Consider, for a moment, the ordinary objects that have been recovered from the wreck, or that survived among the belongings of the rescued. A pocket watch, stopped at the hour its owner entered the freezing water, a pair of spectacles, a child's toy, a piece of china from the dining saloon, A letter written aboard the ship and posted at one of the ports of call, arriving safely though its writer did not. These small things carry a weight far beyond their size, for each of them was touched by human hands, used in the course of ordinary life, part of the small daily texture of the world that ended that night. In these objects, we glimpse the reality of the people who owned them, not as figures in a legend, but as living human beings, who dressed and ate and read and played and loved, who boarded a ship with their hopes intact, who could not have imagined how their voyage would end. To hold such an object in the mind is to feel, for a moment, the reality of the past, the presence of those who are gone. Think, too, of the many stories of individual passengers that have come down to us, each one a small window into a lost life. There were the wealthy and famous, whose names were known and whose fates were widely reported. But there were also the countless ordinary people, the emigrants in the lower decks, whose stories are harder to trace but no less moving. There were young couples emigrating to begin married life in a new country. There were parents taking their children to join fathers who had gone ahead to find work. There were single men and women seeking their fortune, servants traveling with their employers, groups of friends from the same village setting out together. Some survived and lived long lives in America or returned home changed forever. Many did not, and their stories ended in the cold water of the North Atlantic, their hopes for a new life extinguished before they could reach the shore they had crossed the world to find. It is for these ordinary people, above all, that the story of the Titanic deserves to be remembered, for they were the true heart of the voyage, and their loss was the true weight of the tragedy. The story has also given us occasion to reflect on the divisions of the society that built the ship, on the way the fate of the passengers was shaped, in part, by the class into which they had been born and the deck on which they traveled. The higher rates of survival among the first-class passengers and the terrible losses among those in the third class have been much studied and much debated, and while the reasons are complex and not reducible to any single cause, the pattern is real and troubling. The Titanic was a mirror of its age, not only in its splendor but in its inequalities. And the disaster laid those inequalities bare in the starkest possible way. There is a sober lesson in this too, about the ways in which the structures we build into our societies can shape even matters of life and death, and about the value of every human life, regardless of the deck on which it happens to be lived. As we draw near the end of our long journey through this story, let us return once more to that night and hold it gently in the mind. Picture the great ship as she was in her final hour, her lights still burning across the dark water, her band still playing, her decks crowded with people facing the unimaginable. Picture the lifeboats pulling away across the calm Black Sea, carrying those who would be saved. Picture the stars overhead, brilliant and cold and utterly indifferent, and the icebergs drifting silently in the darkness and the vast emptiness of the ocean all around. And then picture the moment when the lights went out and the great ship slipped beneath the surface and the sea grew calm again, as though she had never been. More than 2 miles down, in the eternal dark and the eternal cold, the Titanic came to rest, and there she remains, slowly returning to the sea from which her iron was drawn. Above her, the ocean rolls on as it always has. The ships still cross from the old world to the new. The ice still drifts down each spring from the glaciers of the north, and the great cycle of the sea continues, unchanged by all the works and sorrows of humankind. And yet the memory of the Titanic endures, carried forward through the generations, kept alive in the stories we tell, in the objects we preserve, in the lessons we have learned and the reforms we have made, in the quiet reverence with which we remember those who were lost. The ship is gone, but she is not forgotten, and in that remembrance there is a kind of continued life, a way in which those who died that night remain present among us still. There is a particular quality to the way the Titanic has stayed with us, and it is worth lingering on as the night deepens. Most disasters, however terrible, fade with time into the general sorrow of history, remembered by scholars and by the descendants of those affected but slipping from the wider consciousness of the world. The Titanic has not faded in this way. More than a century after that April night, her name is known across the world, her story told in books and films and exhibitions, her image instantly recognizable, her memory tended by countless people who have no personal connection to her at all. Something about the story has fixed it permanently in the human imagination, and in the quiet of the night it is worth asking, once more and more deeply, what that something is. Perhaps it is that the Titanic stands at a particular moment in time, a moment poised between two worlds. She belonged to the end of a long age of confidence, the last years before the great war that would soon engulf the world and shatter forever the optimism of the age that had built her. In a sense, the sinking of the Titanic can be seen as a kind of prelude to that shattering, an early sign that the confident world of the early 20th century was more fragile than it appeared, that the certainties of that age would not hold. Those who lived through the years that followed, through the war and all that came after, sometimes looked back on the sinking of the Titanic as a moment that marked the end of an era, the last bright flare of a world that was about to pass away. There is a poignancy in this, in the sense of the ship as the final magnificent expression of a world on the edge of its own dissolution. Sailing so proudly toward a future that would prove so different from anything its builders had imagined. Perhaps, too, the story endures because it unfolds on a human scale that we can grasp. Unlike so many of the vast catastrophes of history, the Titanic carried some 2,000 and more people, a number large enough to be significant but small enough to comprehend, and among them were individuals whose names and stories we know, whose fates we can follow, whose choices we can ponder. We can imagine ourselves aboard the ship, can wonder what we would have done, whether we would have found a place in a boat or been left behind, whether we would have shown courage or given way to fear. The story invites this kind of personal reflection, this imaginative entry into the experience of those who are there in a way that grander and more abstract tragedies do not. And in imagining ourselves aboard, we come to feel a kinship with those who lived and died that night, a recognition of our shared humanity across the gulf of time. And perhaps the story endures simply because it is beautiful and terrible in equal measure, because it contains within it so much of what moves the human heart, the beauty of the great ship and the terror of her end, the love and courage shown in the face of death, the sorrow of so many lives cut short, the strange calm of that starlit night upon the still black sea. It is a story that seems almost designed to be remembered, that carries within it the qualities of the great tragic tales that humanity has always told. And yet it is not a tale at all, but something that truly happened to real people on a real night in the real and living world. That combination of the mythic and the real gives the story a power that few other events possess. Let us think now about the many places where the memory of the Titanic is kept, for the remembrance of the disaster has taken many forms across the years. In the city of Belfast, where the ship was built, her memory is honored in the very place of her making, in museums and memorials that tell the story of the shipyard and the workers who raised her, and that remember both the achievement of her construction and the tragedy of her loss. To stand in Belfast today, near the great slipways where the Titanic and her sisters took shape, is to feel the presence of the thousands of men who labored there, the ordinary shipbuilders whose skill and toil brought the great ship into being, and who deserve to be remembered alongside those who sailed and died aboard her. In Southampton, from which the ship sailed, and from which so many of her crew came, the memory of the disaster is woven into the life of the town, in memorials to the crew members who were lost, in the collective remembrance of a community that suffered so grievously. The engineers who stayed at their posts to keep the lights burning and the pumps working as long as possible, and who died to the last man, are remembered with particular honor, for their devotion to duty in the face of certain death has come to stand for a kind of quiet heroism that asks for no reward. Across the town and across the country, small memorials mark the losses of individuals and groups, the musicians, the postal workers, the stewards and stewardesses, all the ordinary working people who went down with the ship, and in the many places to which the passengers were traveling, and from which they had come. The memory is kept as well, in the towns and villages of Ireland and Scandinavia, and the many other lands from which the emigrants set out, where families remembered for generations the relatives who had sailed on the great ship and never arrived. In the cities of America, where the survivors came ashore, and where the descendants of both the lost and the saved still live. The story is remembered too, part of the great history of immigration that shaped that nation, a reminder of the hopes and the hardships of those who crossed the sea to build new lives. There is a cemetery in the Canadian city of Halifax, in Nova Scotia, where many of the victims of the disaster are buried, for it was to Halifax that ships were sent to recover the bodies of those who had died and been left floating in the sea after the sinking. The recovery of the dead was itself a solemn and difficult undertaking, and many of those recovered could not be identified, and were buried beneath simple markers bearing only a number and the date of the disaster. To walk among these graves is to be reminded of the reality of the loss in the most direct and sobering way of the individual human beings, each with a name and a life, even where the name is no longer known, who lie there in that quiet ground far from home. Among them is the grave of an unknown child, whose identity long remained a mystery, and whose small grave became a focus of particular tenderness, a symbol of all the innocent lives lost, of all the children who did not survive that night. In recent years, through careful scientific work, the identity of this child was at last established, and a name was restored to the small grave, a quiet act of remembrance across the century, a final gift to a child who had been lost for so long. These places of memory scattered across the world are the visible signs of a remembrance that runs deeper than any monument. For the true memorial to the Titanic is the story itself, told and retold, kept alive in the telling, passed from one generation to the next. Each time the story is told, those who were lost are remembered once more, their reality affirmed, their place in the human family honored. There is a kind of immortality in this, not the immortality the age of the Titanic dreamed of, the conquest of nature and the endless march of progress, but a quieter and more human immortality, the immortality of memory, of being remembered, of mattering to those who come after. The people who died aboard the Titanic could not have known that their names and stories would be spoken across the world more than a century later, that their voyage would become one of the most remembered events in all of history. And yet so it has come to pass, and in that remembrance there is a comfort, a sense that no life is truly lost so long as it is remembered. As the night grows late and the story draws toward its close, let us return one final time to the sea, to the vast and patient ocean that has held the Titanic all these years. The North Atlantic rolls on, as it did before the ship was built, and as it will long after all who remember her are themselves gone. Its waters are cold and deep and full of their own life, indifferent to the works of humankind, endlessly moving, endlessly the same. Somewhere beneath those waters, in the darkness where no light has ever reached, save the brief visits of those who have come to look upon the wreck, the Titanic rests, slowly returning to the elements, her great iron body dissolving grain by grain into the sea, her decks silent, her rooms filled with the black water of the deep, her long voyage finally and forever at an end. And yet, in the quiet of the night, it is possible to think of her not only as she is now broken and rusting in the dark, but as she was in the days of her brief and shining life. It is possible to picture her as she sailed from Southampton on that April afternoon, her hull black and gleaming, her funnels tall against the spring sky, her decks crowded with people waving and cheering, her whole vast bulk moving out into the channel toward the open sea. It is possible to picture the days of her voyage, the fine weather, the calm sea, the passengers strolling on the decks and dining in the grand rooms and dancing in the lower decks, the whole floating world of her alive with human warmth and hope. It is possible to picture her on that last clear night, her lights blazing across the dark water, a small bright island of human life and comfort moving through the immense darkness of the ocean, carrying her many souls toward a future that most of them believed lay bright before them. This, too, is the Titanic, and this is how she deserves to be remembered, not only in her end, but in her life, in the beauty and the hope that she embodied, in the ordinary human happiness of those who sailed aboard her before the ice came out of the dark. The story of the Titanic is in the end a story about us, about human beings and our dreams and our limits, about the things we build and the confidence we place in them, about the way that even our greatest works remain subject to chance and to the vast forces of the world that we can never fully master. It is a story about the courage and the love that people can show in the face of the worst that can happen, and about the sorrow of loss, and about the way that memory can hold on to what time has taken away. It is a story that asks us to be humble before the world, and gentle with one another, and mindful of the preciousness and the fragility of each human life. For we never know what lies ahead, and the brightest of voyages can end in darkness, and the calmest of seas can hold the deepest of sorrows. But it is also a story that offers a quiet consolation in its way. For the people who sailed on the Titanic, though so many of them were lost, have not been forgotten. Their story has become one of the great shared stories of humanity, remembered with tenderness and with respect across the generations and across the world. The lessons of their loss have made the seas safer for all who have sailed since, and the ship herself, resting now in the deep, has become a place of memory and of reverence, watched over by the patient ocean, undisturbed in her long rest. There is peace in that thought, the peace of a story completed, of the dead remembered, of the past made meaningful through remembrance. So let us leave the Titanic now, resting in the deep, dark waters where she has lain for so long, in the silence and the cold, far below the rolling waves and the passing ships and the drifting ice. Let us leave the passengers and the crew to their long rest, the wealthy and the poor, the famous and the unknown, the saved and the lost, all of them now part of the great company of those who have gone before us into the silence of history. Let us remember them with gentleness and honor them with our attention and carry their story forward, as it has been carried to us, a quiet light passed from hand to hand across the years. The night is deep now, and the sea is calm, and the great ship rests beneath the waves where the water is always still. The stars that shone over her on that last night still shine over the ocean, cold and bright and far away, as they have shone over all the works and sorrows of humankind since the beginning. And in their light, if we listen closely in the quiet of the dark, we can almost hear the faint strains of music drifting across the water, the band still playing, as it played on that night so long ago, a melody of courage and of grief, fading slowly into the vast silence of the sea. The music grows softer and softer still, until at last it is gone, and there is only the sound of the water, moving gently in the dark, and the deep and endless peace of the ocean at night. Rest now, and let the story settle around you, like the calm sea settling after the passing of a great ship. The Titanic has told her tale, and it is finished, and all is quiet. The lights have gone out over the water, and the stars keep their silent watch, and the deep holds its treasures gently, and the long night draws toward its rest. Sleep well, and let the sea carry you softly, as it carries the memory of all those who sailed upon it, into the deep and dreamless dark, where all voyages end and all sorrows are at last laid down, and where the great ship sleeps, and the waters are still, and the night is at peace.